Whipping created its own language of ownership. Different whip types left distinctive scars that experienced observers could read. The hippopotamus hide whip left thick, raised welts. The split reed created thin, parallel lines. A slave's back became a historical record of every infraction, real or imagined. Legal papyri document acceptable punishment levels: 20 lashes for spoiling food, 40 for attempting escape, 100 for striking a free person. The numbers seem clinical until you understand that 20 lashes with a hippopotamus hide whip could expose bone. 40 could cause permanent nerve damage. 100 was often fatal. Death coming from infections and wounds that were never treated during the Akkad heat. But for all the horrors of life, it was in death that Egyptian slavery revealed its ultimate cruelty. In a civilization that spent more resources on death than life, enslaved women were denied even the mercy of dignified death. When an enslaved woman's body finally failed after decades of labor and abuse, her death was noted only as an inventory adjustment. A papyrus from Deir el-Medina records, "The Syrian woman called Small has died. Replacement requested for grain grinding. 30 years of suffering reduced to a single line of administrative text. No name beyond a descriptor of her size. No mention of burial. Just a request for replacement property." Mass burial pits near pyramid construction sites contain primarily female skeletons showing signs of severe trauma and malnutrition. These weren't proper graves, but dumping grounds, bodies thrown in without ceremony. Without goods for the afterlife. Without even the basic respect of positioning that Egyptians gave to animals. Recent excavations at Amarna revealed a workers' cemetery containing thousands of skeletons. 60% female. The bodies show evidence of brutal lives, spines compressed from carrying massive loads, bones broken and healed incorrectly without medical treatment, teeth worn to nubs. But most telling is what's absent: no grave goods, no inscriptions, no evidence of mummification. These women were denied the afterlife that Egyptians considered the entire purpose of existence. The religious implications went beyond simple cruelty. Egyptians believed that without proper burial rites, the soul couldn't reach the afterlife. Without mummification, the body couldn't be restored in the field of reeds. Without grave goods, the spirit would starve in darkness. Enslaved women weren't just killed, they were condemned to eternal non-existence. Their souls trapped in a limbo that Egyptians considered worse than any hell. Free Egyptians spent entire lives preparing for death, commissioning tomb paintings, accumulating treasures, paying for priests. Enslaved women watched these preparations, knowing they would receive none of them. They served in households where pet cats received better burial treatment than they ever would. But even eternal non-existence wasn't the absolute worst fate. Some women were selected for human sacrifice, dying to serve not just in the afterlife, but as eternal slaves. During Egypt's first dynasty, around 3000 BCE, when King Jair died, he didn't go into the afterlife alone. Surrounding his burial chamber at Abydos, archaeologists found the remains of 318 individuals, most of them young women, between 15 and 25 years old. These weren't honored courtiers who chose to follow their king. These were enslaved women killed specifically to serve him forever. The skeletal evidence tells a story of coordinated mass murder disguised as religious ceremony. The women were dressed in their finest garments, given a final meal evidenced by food remains in their stomach cavities, then poisoned, probably with opium-laced wine. They died in neat rows, positioned as if sleeping, maintaining servant postures even as poison stopped their hearts. But some weren't given the mercy of poison. Strangulation marks on cervical vertebrae suggest certain women were ritually strangled with cords. Others show signs of having their throats cut. The positioning of these bodies reveals the intended eternal social structure. Closest to the king's chamber were young, attractive women, likely concubines expected to provide sexual service in the afterlife. Next came domestic servants, buried with grinding stones and cooking pots. They would continue their labor forever. Later dynasties replaced human sacrifice with shabti figurines. But the transition wasn't immediate. Second, dynasty tombs show fewer sacrificed servants, but still include some human victims. The practice gradually declined, not from moral evolution, but from economic pragmatism. Killing hundreds of slaves for each royal burial was wasteful when those slaves could produce value through continued labor. Yet, even as human sacrifice officially ended, the concept persisted. Enslaved women who died naturally during a pharaoh's lifetime were sometimes preserved and stored, waiting to be buried with their master when he died. Storage rooms near royal tomb complexes contained mummified bodies that waited years or decades for burial, enslaved women whose corpses were property to be deployed when needed. We return to that Nubian teenager stumbling through Thebes' streets in chains during the Akhet flood season of 1450 BCE. 3,500 years later, archaeologists found her bones in an unmarked pit near the nobleman's estate at Deir el-Medina, where she spent 40 years grinding grain. They identified her through the distinctive wear patterns on her skeleton. Catalogued as Specimen EA 7892, knees fused at 90-degree angles from decades of kneeling, spine compressed and twisted from endless grinding motions, teeth worn flat from stone dust, arms showing repetitive stress fractures that healed wrong without treatment. She lived to 55. Ancient by slave standards, her body is a catalog of accumulated suffering that outlasted papyrus records. No Egyptian text records her name. No inscription marks her grave. No goods accompanied her into whatever afterlife she might have found. She exists in history only through the damage written in her bones, a life reconstructed from trauma patterns. A human being whose identity was erased, but whose suffering left indelible marks. She was one of millions of enslaved women whose blood mixed with pyramid mortar, whose children inherited bondage, whose bodies were used, broken, and discarded with less ceremony than Egyptians gave to sacred bulls. Stand before the Great Pyramid of Giza and understand you're looking at a monument built on feminine suffering. Each precisely placed stone represents countless hours of enslaved women's labor during Akhet flood seasons. Walk through Cairo's Egyptian Museum and recognize that every golden artifact was mined by enslaved women. Every piece of fine linen was woven by women whose fingers bled. Every piece of jewelry adorned queens, while the women who crafted it were branded like cattle. The magnificent temples at Karnak and Luxor echo with silenced screams. Egypt gave humanity writing, mathematics, medicine, and monumental architecture, but these gifts were purchased with the freedom, dignity, and lives of enslaved women whose contributions were systematically erased. The Nubian teenager's bones specimen, EA 7892, stored in climate-controlled facility, were recently studied. Scientists can tell she had children from pelvic scarring, that she suffered chronic malnutrition from bone density, that she lived with constant pain from joint damage, They cannot tell us what she thought about while grinding grain for 40 years, what she dreamed about, whether she remembered her homeland. These interior worlds remain forever lost, but her physical suffering left marks that time cannot erase. Every fused joint tells a story of endurance. If you want more historical reality that destroys comfortable myths, subscribe to Flow of History. We're revealing what actually happened behind the legends.